Kara never expected to find a lost child in the middle of a crowded park, but there he was standing alone near the fountain, his small hands clenched into fists, his face streaked with tears. She froze for a moment, scanning the area for a frantic parent, but the sea of strangers moved along, oblivious to the little boy's distress. Taking a deep breath, she approached him cautiously. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said gently, crouching to his level. "Are you lost?" The boy, who looked no older than 5, sniffled and wiped his nose on the sleeve of his tiny designer jacket. "I can't find my daddy," he whimpered. His big brown eyes were filled with panic, and it broke Kara's heart. "Okay, don't worry," she reassured him, offering a warm smile. "We'll find him together." "What's your name?" "Leo," he said, his lip quivering. "Well, Leo, I'm Kara. Can you tell me what your daddy looks like?" Leo nodded, his little face scrunching up in concentration. "He's very tall, and he wears fancy suits, and he's really busy a lot." Kara bit back a smile. That wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. She took his small hand in hers and stood up. "Let's retrace your steps, okay? Maybe we'll find him along the way." Leo nodded, his grip tightening around her fingers as they started walking. She scanned the park, looking for any man who seemed to be searching for a child. The longer they walked, the more she started to worry. What kind of father lost track of his son in such a crowded place? "Does your daddy have a phone number you know?" she asked, Leo's face scrunched up again. "I think so." "But I don't remember all the numbers," she sighed. "That's okay. We'll keep looking." As they walked, Kara did her best to distract Leo with small talk, asking about his favorite cartoons and foods. He was a sweet kid, polite and well-spoken for his age. It was clear he adored his father, even if he was struggling to remember details that could help them find him. After nearly 20 minutes of searching, Kara spotted a man standing near the entrance of the park, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression dark with worry. He was tall just like Leo had described and wore an expensive-looking charcoal suit, his sharp features tense with frustration. Before she could say anything, Leo gasped. "Daddy!" The man's head snapped up, and the moment he saw his son, relief flooded his face. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees as Leo threw himself into his arms. "Leo," the man murmured, holding him tightly. "I was so worried." Leo sniffled against his father's shoulder. "I got lost." Kara took a step back, feeling like an intruder in their reunion. But then the man lifted his gaze, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers. For a brief moment, she forgot how to breathe. The man was ridiculously handsome, strong jawline, neatly styled dark hair, and an air of authority that made it impossible to look away. "You found him?" he asked, his voice deep and commanding. Kara snapped out of it and nodded. "Yes, he was near the fountain. He was scared, but he did great. We walked around looking for you." The man stood, still holding Leo securely. "Thank you," he said, his voice laced with sincerity. "I don't even know how this happened. One moment I was on a call, and the next he was gone." Kara resisted the urge to judge. She didn't know this man's life, but she did know that Leo loved him, and that mattered. "I'm just glad he's safe," she said with a small smile. The man studied her for a moment, as if assessing her. "I'm Roman Blackwood," he finally said. His name sounded vaguely familiar, but Kara couldn't place it. "Kara Hayes," she replied. Roman's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze flicking to Leo, who was still clinging to him. "I owe you for this," he said. "Let me take you to dinner as a thank you." Kara blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, that's really not necessary." "I insist," Roman said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You helped my son." "That's not something I take lightly." Leo perked up. "Daddy, can she come to dinner with us?" Kara hesitated. She wasn't sure if she should get involved in whatever dynamic they had. But when she looked at Leo's hopeful face, and the way Roman was watching her, as if waiting for an excuse to see her again, she felt her resolve waver. "All right," she said finally. "One dinner." Roman nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll send a car for you tonight." Kara should have questioned why a simple dinner needed a car service, But before she could, Roman was already turning away, carrying Leo toward a sleek black car parked at the curb. As she watched them leave, something told her that dinner with Roman Blackwood was going to be far more than she bargained for. Kara's nerves twisted as she stepped out of the sleek black car that had picked her up from her modest apartment. The driver, a man dressed in a sharp uniform, had been polite but distant, answering her questions with short, efficient replies. Now, standing outside an upscale restaurant with glowing golden lights and a name she couldn't even pronounce, she realized just how out of her depth she was. The hostess at the entrance barely blinked before guiding her inside, through a dining room dripping in elegance crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and tables adorned with crisp white linens and flickering candlelight. This wasn't just a dinner, it was an experience. She spotted Roman immediately. He was seated at a prime table near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, dressed in another impeccably tailored suit, his posture effortlessly commanding. But it wasn't just his presence that caught her attention, it was the warmth in his expression, as he watched Leo animatedly chatter about something, his small hands waving in excitement. Leo noticed her first and gasped. "Kara!" He nearly launched himself from his chair before Roman placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, a silent reminder to behave. The boy beamed up at her. "You came," Kara smiled. "Of course I did. I couldn't turn down an invitation from my favorite adventurer." Roman stood as she approached, his gaze sweeping over her. It wasn't the casual once-over she was used to from men, it was an assessment, a quiet appreciation that made her skin warm under his attention. "I'm glad you made it," he said, his voice as smooth as the fine wine being poured at the neighboring table. "I almost didn't," she admitted as she slid into the chair across from him. "It took me 10 minutes just to figure out what to wear," Leo giggled while Roman's lips twitched in amusement. "You look perfect." The unexpected compliment caught her off guard. She cleared her throat, reaching for the menu to distract herself. But when she glanced at the prices, her stomach dropped. She had never seen numbers that high for food before. Before she could say anything, Roman motioned to the waiter. "We'll have the chef's selections for the evening." Just like that, the decision was made. No discussion, no hesitation. Kara wasn't sure if she found it irritating or impressive. As the evening unfolded, she found herself drawn into the conversation more easily than she expected. Leo carried most of it, sharing stories about school, his favorite superheroes, and his dreams of becoming an astronaut. But it was Roman who surprised her the most. He wasn't cold or distant like she had assumed a man of his stature would be. Instead, he listened attentively to his son, responding with genuine interest, his sharp features softening in a way that made him almost approachable. "You and Leo seem really close," Kara observed at one point, watching how Roman adjusted the boy's napkin without a second thought. Roman's expression shifted, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "I try to be," he said. "I didn't have that kind of relationship with my own father, so I make sure Leo knows he comes first." There was weight behind those words, something deeper than he was letting on. Kara hesitated before asking, "And his mother?" Silence stretched between them. Roman's jaw tightened slightly. "She left when Leo was a baby." Leo was too busy poking at his dessert to notice the tension in his father's posture, but Kara didn't miss it. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Roman met her gaze, something unreadable in his own. "Don't be," it was the best thing she could have done for him. Kara didn't press further, it wasn't her place. Instead, she turned her attention back to Leo, who was now making an absolute mess of his chocolate cake. By the time the meal ended, she expected Roman to simply thank her and send her home. But instead, as they stepped outside, he turned to her with an intensity that made her pulse stutter. "I meant what I said earlier, I owe you, and I don't like owing people." Kara raised an eyebrow. "You already repaid me with dinner." "That was just a start," he countered smoothly. "Let me do more." She folded her arms. "More how?" Roman hesitated for a moment, then said, "Come work for me. Kara blinked, certain she had misheard. "Excuse me. I own Blackwood Enterprises," he said, as if that explained everything, and maybe it did. The name suddenly clicked. He wasn't just wealthy, he was one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, and he wanted her to work for him. "I already have a job," she said slowly. "At a bookstore," he replied, his knowledge of her life catching her off guard. "It's admirable, but I can offer you something better." Kara bristled. "I like my job." Roman studied her, then nodded. "Fair enough, but if you ever change your mind, the offer stands." Leo tugged at her hand. "Will I see you again?" Kara softened. "I think so." Roman's gaze lingered on her, something almost challenging in his eyes. "Count on it." And just like that, she knew her life was about to change in ways she never saw coming. Kara told herself she wouldn't think about Roman Blackwood. She told herself she wouldn't replay the way his gaze had lingered on her before she left, or the way his presence had filled every inch of space around him, commanding attention without saying a word. But the moment she stepped into the bookstore the next day, her thoughts betrayed her. She tried to focus, stacking new arrivals onto the shelves, but her mind kept drifting back to his offer. Work for him? It was absurd. She had no experience in the corporate world, no knowledge of what a job under his employment would even look like. And yet, the idea refused to leave her alone. The chime of the front door pulled her back to the present. A customer, she assumed, but when she turned, her breath caught. Roman. Standing in the middle of the shop, dressed in another tailored suit that probably cost more than her rent for the year. He looked completely out of place among the worn wooden shelves and scattered stacks of books, yet he carried himself as if he belonged anywhere he chose to be. She straightened, gripping the book in her hands a little too tightly. "Are you lost this time?" A flicker of something amusement maybe crossed his expression. "No. But I have been thinking about something." Kara exhaled, already knowing where this was going. "If you came to offer me a job again, I came to give you a reason to accept," he cut in smoothly. She folded her arms. "I told you I have a job." "You have a job that barely covers your bills," Roman countered, scanning the store as if evaluating its worth. "And you work far too hard for what little you get in return." Kara stiffened. "I don't need saving." His gaze settled back on her, something unreadable in his expression. "I'm not trying to save you, Kara. I'm offering you an opportunity. One that comes with a significant salary and benefits you won't find here." She clenched her jaw, frustration warring with curiosity. "And what exactly would I be doing?" Roman took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the space between them feel smaller. "I need someone I can trust to look after Leo when I'm working, someone outside of the usual people I hire." Kara blinked. "You want me to be his nanny?" "Not just a nanny," he clarified. "A companion, a mentor, someone who can give him a sense of normalcy." The weight of his words settled over her. He wasn't just throwing money at a problem, he was trying to give his son something he couldn't provide himself. Stability, connection. It was tempting, too tempting. But taking this job meant stepping into Roman's world, and she wasn't sure she belonged there. Sensing her hesitation, Roman reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. "Think about it," he said, holding it out. "When you're ready, call me." She stared at the card before reluctantly taking it. Roman held her gaze for a breath longer than necessary, before turning and walking out the door, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding and her world tilting in a direction she hadn't expected. Kara hesitated for 2 days before calling Roman. It wasn't just about the job, it was about everything that came with it. The intensity of his presence, the way he looked at her like he was trying to unravel something only he could see. But in the end, she couldn't ignore the way Leo's face had lit up when he was with her, and that was enough to make her take the leap. When she arrived at Roman's penthouse for her first day, she expected luxury, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer opulence of his world. The floors gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of the city skyline, and the air carried a faint, expensive scent like cedarwood and something darker, something distinctly Roman. Leo greeted her with an excited hug, already tugging her toward his playroom, but it was the way Roman watched her that unsettled her most. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady as if he had expected her all along. Days passed in a blur. Kara quickly fell into a rhythm with Leo helping with his lessons, exploring the city together, and filling the gaps in his life that Roman's demanding schedule left open. But it was the moments with Roman that shifted something inside her. She caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. During late evenings when he returned from work, still in his suit, his tie loosened just enough to make him look less like a CEO and more like a man. Their conversations started off polite, but they grew longer, deeper. He listened to her in a way that made her feel seen, and that scared her more than anything. One evening, after Leo had fallen asleep, Kara found herself standing on the penthouse balcony, the city lights stretching endlessly before her. She hadn't realized Roman had joined her until he spoke. "You're different from anyone I've ever met." His voice was low, the kind that made the air between them feel charged. She turned to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know if that's a compliment or not," she said, trying to keep things light. "It is," he said, stepping closer. The space between them was minimal now, and she could feel the warmth radiating from him. It would be so easy to close the distance, to let herself fall into whatever this was. But she couldn't. "Roman," she started, but he shook his head. "I know," he murmured. "This wasn't supposed to happen." And yet, neither of them moved away. The next morning, Kara told herself it was nothing. A moment, a fleeting thing that meant nothing. But when Roman brushed past her in the kitchen, his hand grazing against hers just slightly longer than necessary, she knew she was lying to herself. This wasn't nothing, it was everything. Kara told herself she was imagining things. That the way Roman's hand had lingered against hers, the way his gaze seemed to follow her even when he wasn't looking directly at her, meant nothing. But deep down, she knew better. Something was shifting between them, something unspoken but undeniable. She tried to keep her focus on Leo, on her role in his life, but ignoring Roman's presence was impossible. He wasn't just a man who existed in the background of his son's world, he was a force, effortlessly commanding every space he stepped into. One evening, after putting Leo to bed, she found herself in the library, running her fingers along the spines of books that probably hadn't been touched in years. The room was quiet, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls. She hadn't expected Roman to join her. But when she turned, there he was, leaning against the doorway, watching her with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "You spend more time in this room than I do," he said, his voice low but filled with something unreadable. Kara shrugged, pulling a book from the shelf. "It's peaceful here." Roman stepped inside, his presence altering the atmosphere immediately. "You like books?" She glanced at him, arching a brow. "I work in a bookstore, remember?" A faint curve of his lips, but no amusement in his eyes. "I do." Silence stretched between them, thick with something unsaid. Kara turned back to the shelf, but she could feel him watching her. "You've changed things," he murmured after a moment. She hesitated. "What do you mean?" "For Leo." "For this house," he exhaled softly. "For me." Her fingers tightened around the book's spine. "Roman," he stepped closer, the space between them narrowing. "I don't let people in easily," he admitted, his tone quieter now. "But you. You walked into our lives and made it impossible not to." Kara's heart pounded, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "I didn't come here to change anything. And yet, you did." She turned to face him fully, meeting his gaze. "Roman, this isn't." She struggled for the right words. "This isn't simple." His expression didn't waver. "I don't do simple," she swallowed hard. "Leo comes first. He always will." Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe him. But this was dangerous. Being drawn into Roman Blackwood's world didn't just mean stepping into luxury, it meant stepping into him. and she wasn't sure she'd make it out unscathed. Yet, as she looked into his eyes, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't sure she wanted to. The tension between them refused to fade. It lingered in the stolen glances, in the way Roman's presence filled every room Kara stepped into, in the way her pulse quickened whenever he was near. She tried to tell herself that this was just a job, that she was here for Leo, not for whatever was happening between her and his father. But the truth was undeniable. Roman had become impossible to ignore. One evening, as she helped Leo with a puzzle in the living room, Roman entered, his expression unreadable. He surveyed the scene before settling into a chair across from them, watching with an intensity that made Kara's breath hitch. Leo, oblivious to the silent war raging between them, grinned up at his father. Kara's really good at puzzles. She figured out the edges super fast. Roman's lips curved slightly. Is that so? Kara cleared her throat, forcing herself to focus on the puzzle pieces instead of the way Roman's gaze seemed to see right through her. It's just a matter of finding the pattern, she said, trying to keep her voice even. Roman leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. And what about people? Do you find their patterns just as easily? Kara's fingers froze on a puzzle piece. That was a dangerous question, and they both knew it. I try not to make assumptions, she replied carefully. His eyes darkened, something unreadable flickering behind them. And yet, I feel like you've already made plenty about me. She inhaled slowly, forcing herself to hold his gaze. I only know what you choose to show me. Roman didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, as if weighing his next words. Then, finally, he exhaled. I want to show you more. Kara's heart pounded, but before she could respond, Leo let out a triumphant cheer. Finished? He clapped his hands together, completely oblivious to the charged atmosphere hanging between the adults. Kara tore her gaze from Roman and smiled at Leo. Great job, buddy. Roman's expression softened as he looked at his son, but when his gaze returned to Kara, the intensity was still there. Let me take you to dinner. Kara's breath caught. Roman, not as a transaction. Not as a thank you, he interrupted, his voice quieter now. Just as two people who have unfinished business. She hesitated, every instinct telling her this was dangerous. But then she saw the way his jaw tightened, as if bracing himself for rejection, and something in her cracked. Against her better judgment, she nodded. Roman's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something victorious. I'll pick you up tomorrow night. The next evening, when the sleek black car pulled up outside her building, Kara nearly lost her nerve. But when she stepped inside and saw Roman waiting for her, dressed in a dark suit with an open collar, his gaze locking onto hers the moment she entered, she knew there was no turning back. Dinner was at a restaurant so exclusive, it didn't even have a name on the door. The staff greeted Roman with quiet deference, leading them to a private table near a panoramic window overlooking the city. The conversation started light discussions about Leo, about Kara's favorite books, but as the night progressed, the walls between them began to crumble. Roman swirled the wine in his glass, watching her carefully. Do you always run from things that scare you? Kara's pulse jumped. I don't run. His lips pressed together, unconvinced. Then why do I feel like you've been keeping me at arm's length? She inhaled sharply. Because I don't belong in your world, Roman. His expression darkened. You think this is about status. It's about everything, she admitted. You live in a world of power and influence. I work in a bookstore. Roman leaned forward, his voice low but firm. You think I care about any of that? She looked away. It's not just that, it's Leo. He's the most important thing in all of this. She hesitated, then forced herself to continue. If we cross a line and it doesn't work, he's the one who gets hurt. Roman was silent for a long moment. Then slowly he reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. I don't take risks when it comes to my son, he said quietly, but I also don't walk away from something that matters. Her breath hitched. Roman. I want you, Kara. His voice was rough now, raw with something he wasn't used to admitting. And I don't just mean for tonight or for a passing moment. I've spent my life building walls, keeping people out. But you walked right through them. Kara's chest tightened. She had spent so much time trying to convince herself that this was temporary, that whatever was between them would fade. But hearing him say it out loud made it impossible to deny. She had fallen for him, and there was no going back. Roman watched her, waiting, giving her the space to make the decision for herself, and so she did. She turned her hand over, letting her fingers lace with his. Roman's grip tightened just slightly, his expression shifting into something relieved, something fierce. They had both spent too long running, but not anymore. This time they were choosing each other, and neither of them would ever look back.